January 22nd, 1879. 11:30 a.m. The South African sun beat down mercilessly on the British camp at Isandlwana, a massive sandstone outcrop shaped like a sphinx that dominated the landscape. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline stood outside his tent, reviewing the morning's dispatch from Lord Chelmsford, the British commander who had taken most of the column deeper into Zululand chasing phantom reports of Zulu forces. Pauline commanded roughly 1,800 men, a mixture of imperial troops, colonial volunteers, and native auxiliaries spread across a camp that stretched over a mile. What Pauline didn't know, what none of the British commanders could have imagined, was that less than 5 miles away, concealed in the depths of the Ngwebeni Valley, 20,000 Zulu warriors sat in absolute silence, waiting for the order to attack. The disaster at Isandlwana wasn't simply a military defeat. It was the catastrophic collision between the most advanced military machine in the world and an indigenous fighting system that European observers had consistently underestimated and misunderstood. The British Army of 1879 was the product of industrial revolution, armed with breech-loading rifles, artillery and tactics refined through decades of colonial warfare. The Zulu Impi represented something entirely different, a warrior culture that had perfected the art of shock assault through generations of refinement under the brilliant military mind of King Shaka Kasenzanga Kona. The events that would unfold over the next 4 hours would shatter British confidence, destroy an entire imperial column, and reveal that technological superiority meant nothing when tactical doctrine failed. This is the story of how the Zulu Impi formation, the legendary horns of the buffalo, didn't just defeat a British force, it obliterated it, killing over 1,300 men in what remains the worst defeat inflicted on a modern army by an indigenous force using primarily pre-industrial weapons. To understand the disaster at Isandlwana, you must first understand what the British were facing. The Zulu military system wasn't some disorganized tribal militia. It was a sophisticated, disciplined fighting machine that had dominated southern Africa for 60 years. King Shaka had revolutionized Zulu warfare in the early 19th century, transforming loose confederations of clan militias into a unified military state built around a single revolutionary concept: close combat shock assault executed with absolute discipline. Shaka had abolished the traditional fighting style of thrown spears and ritualized combat, replacing it with the Ikalwa, a short stabbing spear with an 18-inch blade designed for one purpose: killing at arm's length. He developed the Ishlangu, a large cowhide shield that could deflect blows and hide the fighter's movements. Most importantly, he created the Impi system, regimental formations organized by age groups that trained together, fought together, and lived in military kraals under direct royal control. By 1879, under King Cetshwayo Kampande, the Zulu military had evolved into a force of approximately 40,000 warriors divided into regiments, or amabutho, each with distinctive shield colours and fighting traditions. These weren't farmers who picked up spears when trouble came. They were career warriors who had trained since adolescence in the use of weapons, formation fighting and endurance marching that could cover 50 miles in a day. The average Zulu warrior could maintain a running pace for hours while carrying a shield, multiple spears, rations and sleeping mat. Their conditioning was legendary. British troops marching 15 miles in a day considered it hard work. Zulu Impis regularly covered double that distance while maintaining combat readiness. The tactical formation that made Zulu warfare so effective was the Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo. This wasn't just a clever metaphor, it was a sophisticated tactical system designed to envelop and destroy an enemy through coordinated maneuver. The formation consisted of 4 elements: the chest, the main body of veteran warriors who would pin the enemy in place through frontal assault; the horns, 2 mobile wings of younger, faster warriors who would race around the flanks to surround the enemy; the loins, a reserve force that sat with backs to the battle to avoid premature commitment, ready to exploit success or cover retreat; and the head, the commanding officers who controlled the battle through runners and visible signals. This formation required extraordinary discipline. The horns had to move swiftly, but hold their attack until the chest engaged. The chest had to fix the enemy without breaking before the horns completed their encirclement. The loins had to resist the urge to join the fighting until ordered. All of this had to happen across miles of terrain, often without direct communication, with warriors maintaining formation while under fire. The British had seen Zulu tactics in previous conflicts and in skirmishes during the current invasion, but they fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. British military doctrine in 1879 was built around firepower. The Martini-Henry rifle, adopted in 1871, was a breech-loading single-shot weapon that fired a massive .45 caliber bullet with devastating effect. In trained hands, it could achieve 12 aimed shots per minute out to effective ranges exceeding 400 yards. British infantry tactics assumed that disciplined volley fire would break any attack long before it reached bayonet range. This doctrine had worked brilliantly against other indigenous forces. In 1868, at the Battle of Magdala in Ethiopia, British troops had slaughtered thousands of Ethiopian warriors who charged their positions. In Sudan, on the northwest frontier of India, in New Zealand against the Maori, British firepower had consistently prevailed. The assumption was simple: rifles beat spears, civilization beat savagery, discipline beat courage. Every precedent suggested the Zulus didn't have a chance. What the British failed to understand was that the Zulus had developed tactics specifically designed to minimize exposure to firepower while maximizing the effectiveness of close combat. Zulu warriors advanced in loose formations that made artillery relatively ineffective. They used terrain religiously, moving through dead ground and using hills and valleys to approach unseen. Most critically, they understood that the key to defeating rifle fire was speed. If you could close the distance before the enemy could reload enough times to break your formation, if you could get inside the killing zone and into hand-to-hand combat, rifles became useless clubs, and the short-stabbing spear became king. The British invasion of Zululand in January 1879 was undertaken with supreme confidence. Lord Chelmsford commanded 3 columns, totalling about 17,000 men, including 5,000 British regulars and the rest colonial volunteers and native auxiliaries. The plan was straightforward: invade from 3 directions, converge on Ulundi, the Zulu capital, and force Cetshwayo to submit to British authority. The actual causes of the war were complex, involving disputes over borders, British demands for the dismantling of the Zulu military system, and imperial ambitions to federate South Africa under British control. But the military calculus seemed simple. British firepower would make quick work of Zulu spears. Chelmsford's centre column, No. 3 column, crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift on January 11, 1879. The force included the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, later known as the South Wales Borderers, one of the British Army's most distinguished units, 6 companies of the 2nd Battalion 24th, N Battery of the Royal Artillery with 6 field guns, colonial mounted volunteers, native auxiliary forces and hundreds of wagons carrying supplies. In total, the column numbered about 4,700 men, though only a portion would be at Isandlwana on the day of battle. The 24th Regiment of Foot wore the traditional British red coat, though by 1879 khaki was beginning to replace it in some theatres. They carried the Martini-Henry rifle, 70 rounds of ammunition in pouches and bandoliers, and a sword bayonet. Each company was a self-contained fighting unit of about 100 men led by a captain or senior lieutenant. These were professional soldiers, many of them long-service veterans who had seen action in previous colonial campaigns. They were trained to fight in close order, to deliver massed volley fire, and to trust in their firepower and discipline. They had absolute confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy, regardless of numbers. The march toward Isandlwana began on January 20th. Chelmsford established a camp beneath the distinctive mountain, intending it as a temporary base before pushing deeper into Zululand. This was the first critical error. Chelmsford, despite being warned by Boer advisors who had fought the Zulus before, refused to lager the camp. Lagering meant forming the wagons into a defensive circle, creating a fortified position that was standard practice in South African warfare. Chelmsford considered it unnecessary and time-consuming. British troops didn't hide behind wagons. They stood in the open and shot their enemies down. This decision would prove fatal. The camp at Isandlwana stretched along the lower slopes of the mountain in a rough line about a mile long. The tents were arranged in neat rows according to regulations. The artillery was parked in the centre, ammunition was stored in wagons, and pickets were posted on the heights above the camp. But there was no defensive perimeter, no fortification, no preparation for defence. The camp was organised for comfort and administration, not combat. To Chelmsford and his staff, The idea that the Zulus might attack a force this size in open ground seemed absurd. Zulu tactics, they believed, relied on ambush and surprise. A British force in the open, armed with modern rifles and artillery, was invulnerable to frontal assault. On the morning of January 22nd, Chelmsford received reports from mounted scouts that Zulu forces were spotted to the southeast. Convinced this was the main Zulu army, he took roughly half his force, about 2,500 men including most of the artillery and mounted troops, and marched to engage them. This left Pauline with approximately 800 men to guard the camp, including 5 companies of the 1st Battalion 24th Regiment, 1 company of the 2nd Battalion 24th, several hundred native auxiliaries, and a handful of mounted colonial volunteers and 1 artillery piece. Chelmsford's last words to Pauline were explicit: defend the camp. He was not to move the force or advance beyond the immediate area. Chelmsford expected to return by evening after dispersing what he assumed was a Zulu raiding party. What neither Chelmsford nor Pauline knew was that the force Chelmsford was chasing was a deliberate diversion, a small detachment meant to draw the British away from their camp. The main Zulu army, 20,000 warriors under the command of Chief Nchingwayo Kamahol and Chief Mavumengwana Kandlela, was concealed in the Ngwebeni Valley just 5 miles northeast of Isandlwana. This army represented the main strength of the Zulu military, including the Ukandempemvu regiment, the Umbonambi, the Umakijo, the Unodwengu, and a dozen other Amabuto. These warriors had been sitting in the valley since the previous day, waiting for the right moment to attack. The discovery of the Zulu army happened by accident. Around 11 a.m., Lieutenant Charles Raw, of the Natal Native Horse, leading a patrol on the high ground northeast of the camp, chased a small group of Zulu herders over a ridge. What Raw saw when he crested that ridge stopped him cold. The entire Ngwebeni Valley was filled with warriors, 20,000 men sitting in regimental blocks in absolute silence, their shields and spears catching the sun. For a moment, neither side moved. Then the Zulu commanders, realizing they'd been discovered and that surprise was lost, gave the order to attack. The entire army rose as one and began to move. Raw immediately sent a rider back to camp with a warning and deployed his small force to slow the Zulu advance. But 100 men, even mounted men with rifles, couldn't stop 20,000 warriors. The Zulu formation deployed with practiced precision. The chest, consisting of the Umakijo, Umbonambi, and other veteran regiments, perhaps 10,000 warriors, advanced straight toward the British camp. The right horn, the younger, faster warriors of the Ukandempemvu and Umbulazi regiments, perhaps 5,000 men, swept wide to the north, aiming to circle behind Isandlwana Mountain and cut off retreat toward Rorke's Drift. The left horn, another 5,000 warriors from the Unodwengu and other regiments, moved to the south to envelop the British left flank. The loins, the reserve regiments, followed behind the chest, ready to be committed where needed. This entire movement, orchestrated across miles of broken terrain, happened with a speed and coordination that shocked British observers. Back at the camp, Pauline received Raw's warning around 11:30 a.m. He immediately ordered the camp to stand to arms. The 5 companies of the 1st Battalion 24th, designated Companies A, C, E, F, and H, were deployed in a firing line about 1,500 yards in front of the camp, running roughly parallel to the mountain. The single company of 2nd Battalion, G Company, under Lieutenant Charles Pope, was positioned on the far right of the line. The native auxiliaries, the Natal native contingent, were deployed on the flanks. The artillery piece was positioned to provide covering fire. This was textbook British deployment, a solid line of riflemen with clear fields of fire properly spaced with artillery support. Against any conventional enemy, it would have been devastating. The first Zulu warriors appeared on the ridge above the camp around noon. British observers later described it as a black line that seemed to materialize out of the ground. Then the line thickened and began to move down the slope like a dark flood. The Zulu advance wasn't a wild charge. It was a controlled, rhythmic movement, warriors trotting in loose formation, maintaining alignment, their shields held ready, their commanders visible in the ranks, directing movement with staffs and shouts. At 800 yards, the British opened fire. The first volley from several hundred Martini Henry rifles should have torn great gaps in the Zulu ranks, and it did. Warriors fell, bodies tumbling down the slope, but the formation didn't break. The Zulu warriors had been trained to accept casualties as the price of closing with the enemy. They knew that if they could endure the rifle fire long enough to get into close combat, their numbers and their weapons would prevail. The advance continued. The Martini-Henry rifle was a powerful weapon, but it had limitations that would prove critical. The breech-loading mechanism allowed relatively fast reloading, but the heavy 45 caliber rounds created intense recoil that made rapid aimed fire difficult. After a dozen shots, the barrel became hot enough to burn hands. After several dozen shots, the rifle became too hot to hold without wrapping it in cloth. Most critically, in the heat of battle, soldiers working the breech mechanism frantically could damage the extractor, the small claw that pulled spent cartridges from the chamber. If the extractor broke, the rifle became a single-shot weapon requiring manual extraction of each case with a knife or rod, reducing the rate of fire to perhaps 2 shots per minute. As the Zulu chest advanced, British fire intensified. Volleys crashed out at increasing frequency, the distinctive crack of Martini-Henry rifles echoing off the mountain. Zulu warriors fell by dozens, then hundreds, but there were always more. For every warrior who fell, 3 more took his place. The formation maintained its cohesion, maintained its advance. At 400 yards, individual British soldiers began picking targets instead of firing in volleys. The rate of fire increased, but so did the ammunition consumption. This was when the British began to realise they faced a problem. The ammunition was stored in wagons behind the lines, packed in wooden crates sealed with copper bands and screws. Each crate contained 600 rounds. Under normal circumstances, runners would fetch ammunition and distribute it along the line. But there had been no time to establish proper ammunition distribution points. The quartermasters, following regulations, were reluctant to simply break open crates and hand out ammunition without proper accounting. Minutes were lost as soldiers ran back to the wagons, waited for quartermasters to open crates with screwdrivers, received 1 or 2 packets of 10 rounds, and ran back to the firing line. The system that worked perfectly on the parade ground was breaking down under combat conditions. Meanwhile, the Zulu horns were executing their mission with terrifying efficiency. The right horn, the Ukanda Pemvu regiment, had swept wide to the north and was now racing behind Isandlwana mountain, completely invisible to the British. These warriors, many of them in their early 20s, were running at a pace that would have exhausted European soldiers in minutes. They covered more than 3 miles in less than 30 minutes, moving through broken ground at a sustained run. Their objective was the British rear, the wagon park, and the line of retreat toward Rorke's Drift. The left horn, moving south, encountered the first serious resistance. Native auxiliaries and a small force of colonial volunteers were positioned on the British left. These troops, less disciplined and more aware of Zulu fighting capabilities than the British regulars, could see what was happening. The Zulu formation was wrapping around the British flanks like a closing fist. The native troops, many of whom were traditional enemies of the Zulus but also understood Zulu military capability, began to waver. When the left horn, thousands of warriors strong, came pouring around the southern end of the British line, the native auxiliaries broke and ran. This collapse exposed the left flank of the British firing line. At the centre, the chest was still advancing under withering fire. British soldiers were now firing as fast as they could work the mechanism, grabbing cartridges from pouches, working the lever, aiming, firing. The efficiency of fire was dropping as rifles overheated and extractors began to fail. Some soldiers were using knife points to pry spent cartridges from chambers. Others were picking up rifles from wounded comrades when their own weapons jammed. The ammunition problem was becoming critical. Soldiers were running out of rounds in their pouches and bandoliers, and the resupply from the wagons couldn't keep pace with consumption. Around 12:45 p.m., roughly 45 minutes after the battle began, the Zulu chest reached 200 yards from the British line. This was point-blank range for Martini-Henry rifles, the distance at which individual aim shots were devastating. Zulu casualties were horrific. The ground between the British line and the advancing warriors was carpeted with bodies. But the advance continued. Warriors were now running, their shields held forward, their stabbing spears ready. The British fire reached a crescendo, a continuous rolling crash of rifles that merged into sustained thunder. Then the Zulu formation did something that broke British understanding of combat. Instead of charging straight into the fire, the chest went to ground. Thousands of warriors dropped simultaneously into the grass and behind rocks, making themselves nearly invisible. The British firing line, expecting the climactic charge, suddenly had nothing to shoot at. The Zulu warriors, lying flat, were virtually immune to rifle fire. This was a trained tactical manoeuvre. The chest would pin the British in place while the horns completed their encirclement. Every second the British spent shooting at warriors in the grass was a second the horns were moving. Pullein, standing near the artillery piece with his staff, could see the tactical situation deteriorating. His front was held for the moment, but reports were coming in that Zulu forces were on both flanks and moving behind the camp. He made a decision that seemed reasonable given his training and experience. He ordered a fighting withdrawal back to the camp, intending to consolidate his force and establish a defensive perimeter among the tents and wagons. This was standard tactical doctrine. When flanked, withdraw to a prepared position and establish a concentrated defence. The order to withdraw was the moment the battle was lost. British infantry tactics assumed that disciplined soldiers could conduct a fighting retreat, falling back in stages while maintaining fire. Each rank would fire, then retire past the next rank, which would fire to cover their movement. In theory, this created a continuous wall of fire that prevented enemy pursuit. In practice, against an enemy like the Zulus, it was suicide. The moment the British line began to pull back, the Zulu chest rose from the ground and charged. 10,000 warriors surged forward in a sprint, closing the 200-yard gap in less than a minute. Simultaneously, the horns, having completed their encirclement, attacked from both flanks and rear. The British found themselves retreating into an enemy that was already behind them. What happened next was the nightmare scenario that British tactics couldn't address. The neat companies, the organised firing line, the disciplined volleys, all of it disintegrated into desperate hand-to-hand combat across a mile of ground. British soldiers, trained to fight in formation with mutual support, were suddenly fighting as individuals or in small groups, surrounded by warriors who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of combat. The Martini Henry rifle with its sword bayonet was 5 feet long. It was designed for fighting in formation, not individual combat. The Iklewa stabbing spear was 3 feet long, perfectly balanced for one-handed use, designed to be used with a shield. In close combat, the spear had every advantage. A Zulu warrior could use his shield to deflect or entangle a bayonet thrust, then step inside and drive the Iklewa into his opponent's torso. The British soldiers, many of them fighting hand-to-hand for the first time in their lives, faced warriors who had trained for this moment since childhood. The slaughter was systematic. The Zulu tactical system was designed to kill efficiently. Warriors would use their shields to form barriers, then stab over and around them in coordinated attacks. Multiple warriors would attack a single opponent, one engaging from the front while others struck from the sides. The Iklewa was designed to kill with a single thrust. The 18-inch blade was wide enough to create massive internal trauma and shaped to withdraw easily. A warrior could strike, kill, and be ready to engage the next opponent in seconds. British accounts from the few survivors described watching soldiers surrounded by warriors, stabbed multiple times, falling and being immediately set upon by more attackers. The Zulu military system had perfected the art of killing at close quarters, and it was being demonstrated with terrible efficiency across the battlefield. Companies A, C and E of the 1st Battalion 24th Regiment were caught in the open, between the camp and the advancing Zulu chest. These companies, approximately 300 men, fought with desperate courage. They formed back-to-back squares, small islands of red coats surrounded by a sea of shields and spears. For minutes they held, firing point-blank into the press of warriors, using rifles as clubs when ammunition ran out, fighting with bayonets when the enemy closed. But there was no relief, no rescue possible. One by one, the squares were overwhelmed. The last survivors of these companies died in small groups, their bodies found later surrounded by expended cartridge cases and dead Zulus. F Company, under Captain George Waddell, and H Company, under Captain George Mostyn, attempted to retreat back to the camp in good order. They formed a line facing the pursuing Zulu chest and conducted a fighting withdrawal, each rank firing and falling back in rotation. For several hundred yards this worked. The Zulu advance hesitated under the fire, but then the left horn, having swept around the British flank, struck H Company from the side. The formation collapsed instantly. Warriors poured into the gap and the company disintegrated into fleeing individuals. Most were cut down within yards. Mostyn himself was killed near the camp. his body found later with 25 assegai wounds. G Company of the 2nd Battalion, positioned on the British right, had the furthest to retreat. Lieutenant Pope led his men back toward the mountain, trying to reach high ground where they might establish a defensive position. They made it to a rocky spur on the shoulder of Isandlwana and formed a rough square. Here, with their backs to rock and clear fields of fire, G Company made its last stand. For 20 minutes, they held, firing into the masses of warriors that surrounded them. The Zulu commanders threw regiment after regiment against this position. The warriors couldn't use their normal encirclement tactics against an enemy with their backs to stone. They had to attack frontally, and the British fire was devastating at point-blank range. Bodies piled up around the position. But ammunition was running out, and there were always more warriors. When the last cartridge was fired, the Zulus rushed the position and overwhelmed it in hand-to-hand combat. G Company was annihilated to the last man. Back at the camp itself, the situation had become apocalyptic. The Zulu Right Horn, the Ukunda Mpemvu Regiment, had completed its sweep around the mountain and was now attacking from the rear, pouring through the wagon park and the neat rows of tents. Quartermasters, cooks, bandsmen, all the non-combatants who made up a military camp were caught in the open and slaughtered. Soldiers who had survived the fighting retreat found themselves attacked from behind as they tried to reach the camp. The entire British position had been completely enveloped. There was no defensive line, no formation, no organised resistance. It was chaos, with small groups of soldiers fighting desperately while being systematically hunted down by warriors who controlled every avenue of escape. The ammunition wagons, which might have resupplied the defenders, were now behind Zulu lines. The quartermasters who had been so careful about properly accounting for ammunition were dead. The artillery piece, which might have broken Zulu formations with canister shot, was overrun after firing just a handful of rounds. The gunners died around their weapon, fighting with handspikes and fists when they had nothing else. Lieutenant Colonel Pauline, the camp commander, died near the headquarters tent, his body found later with his sword in hand. He had stayed at his post trying to organise a defence that was no longer possible, until the warriors reached him. For soldiers trapped in the camp, the only option was flight. Hundreds of men, British regulars, colonial volunteers, native auxiliaries, fled toward the Buffalo River and Rorke's Drift, 12 miles away. The Zulu Right Horn, having completed its mission of blocking the retreat, now pursued with systematic efficiency. Warriors ran down fleeing soldiers on foot. Mounted men, who might have escaped, found their horses exhausted or were pulled from the saddle by warriors who grabbed reins or legs. The route toward the river became a killing ground. Bodies lined the track for miles, men who had run until exhaustion overtook them and then died with assegais in their backs. Some soldiers made it to the Buffalo River, a rain-swollen torrent that marked the border of Zulu land. Those who could swim tried to cross. Many drowned in the current, weighed down by equipment. Those who made the far bank and collapsed in exhaustion were finished by pursuing warriors who crossed behind them. A handful of mounted men, perhaps 60 out of the original force of 1800, made it back to Rorke's Drift. They arrived in groups over the afternoon, spreading news of the disaster, their accounts seeming so impossible that initially they weren't believed. By 2:30 p.m, just 3 hours after the battle began, it was over. The camp at Isandlwana was silent except for the cries of wounded men being finished by Zulu warriors who moved through the wreckage with assegais. The entire British force had been destroyed. Of the approximately 1,800 men in the camp that morning, fewer than 60 Europeans survived. The native auxiliaries suffered even worse casualties, with perhaps 500 dead out of 800. The 1st Battalion 24th Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 5 companies, the backbone of a famous regiment, had been wiped out. The Zulu losses were significant but not crippling. Perhaps 2,000 warriors had been killed and another 1,000 seriously wounded. But the Zulu military system could absorb these casualties. The dead would be mourned, but the regiments remained intact, their tactical cohesion unbroken. More importantly, the Zulus had achieved something unprecedented. They had destroyed a modern military force in open battle using predominantly pre-industrial weapons. When news of Isandlwana reached Britain, the reaction was shock and disbelief. The British public couldn't comprehend how a savage tribe armed with spears could annihilate British regulars equipped with modern rifles. The press demanded answers. Military analysts searched for explanations. Some blamed Pauline for failing to leg the camp. Some blamed Chelmsford for dividing his force. Some blamed the ammunition supply failure. All of these factors contributed, but they missed the fundamental truth. The Zulu military system had been specifically designed to defeat firepower-based tactics through speed, discipline, and tactical sophistication. The Zulu commanders who planned and executed the battle at Isandlwana demonstrated a level of tactical competence that rivaled any military force in the world. The deployment of the Mpondo Zankamo formation across 5 miles of terrain, the timing of the attacks to pin the British centre while the Horns completed their encirclement, the discipline that kept the chest in formation under withering rifle fire, the speed of the right horn that covered more than 3 miles in under 30 minutes. All of this required training, leadership, and battlefield command that the British had never expected from an African army. The British response to Isandlwana was to send massive reinforcements to South Africa. Within months, 6 additional battalions of infantry, more artillery, more cavalry, and modern equipment including Gatling guns and rocket batteries arrived. The war continued for another 6 months, culminating in the Battle of Ulundi on July 4, 1879, where a British force formed in a defensive square with artillery support defeated a Zulu army in open ground. But Ulundi was fought on British terms, with prepared defences and overwhelming firepower. The Zulus never again had the opportunity to use their tactical system to its full advantage. The destruction of the 24th Regiment at Isandlwana traumatised the British Army. The regiment was rebuilt, given new honours to replace those lost with the colours at the battle, and continued its service. But the names of the dead were inscribed on memorials, and the battle became a cautionary tale taught at military academies. The lesson learned wasn't about indigenous capabilities or tactical sophistication. It was about the importance of defensive preparation, ammunition supply, and never underestimating an enemy. The deeper lesson, that tactical doctrine mattered more than technological advantage, that discipline and speed could defeat firepower, that indigenous military systems could be sophisticated and effective, these lessons were largely ignored. For the Zulu kingdom, Isandlwana was a Pyrrhic victory. They had won the battle but couldn't win the war. British industrial capacity, the same force that had produced the rifles and ammunition at Isandlwana, ensured that losses could be replaced indefinitely. The Zulu military system, for all its tactical brilliance, couldn't sustain a long war against an opponent who could ship reinforcements from across the world. Within 6 months of Isandlwana, the Zulu kingdom was conquered, King Cetshwayo was captured, and the Impi system was dismantled by British decree. But for one day, on a January morning beneath a sphinx-shaped mountain in South Africa, the Zulu military system proved that technology wasn't destiny, that courage and discipline and tactical brilliance could overcome rifles and artillery, that the horns of the buffalo could collapse the ranks of the most powerful empire on earth. 300 British soldiers died at Isandlwana, caught in a tactical system they didn't understand, fighting an enemy they had underestimated, destroyed by warriors whose sophistication they had never acknowledged. The British had marched into Zululand expecting easy victory. They found instead that the Zulu Impi was one of the most effective military forces in the world, and they learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, written in blood on the slopes of Isandlwana. The aftermath of Isandlwana revealed details that made the disaster even more shocking to Victorian sensibilities. When British forces finally returned to the battlefield weeks later, they found scenes that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The bodies of British soldiers had been ritually disemboweled, a Zulu practice called kwaka, which released the spirit of the dead and prevented it from haunting the warriors who had killed them. To British observers, this appeared as mutilation and desecration. To the Zulus, it was a necessary spiritual practice that showed respect for brave enemies. This cultural misunderstanding would fuel British propaganda about Zulu savagery, conveniently ignoring that the killing itself had been a legitimate act of war against an invading force. The weapons recovered from the battlefield told their own story. Hundreds of Martini Henry rifles were found with their actions jammed open, spent cartridges stuck in the chambers, evidence of the extraction failures that had crippled British firepower at the critical moment. Ammunition boxes were found unopened, the copper bands still sealed, scattered around the camp where quartermasters had died before they could distribute their contents. Some British soldiers had died with empty cartridge pouches, having fired every round they carried, while yards away lay boxes containing thousands of rounds that never reached the firing line. The Zulu perspective on the battle came from warriors who survived and spoke to missionaries and colonial officials in later years. Their accounts revealed a battle plan of extraordinary sophistication. The main Zulu army had remained hidden in the Ngwebeni Valley for more than 24 hours before the battle, warriors sitting in absolute silence while scouts monitored British movements. The plan had been to attack on January 23rd, a day considered auspicious by Zulu tradition. But Lieutenant Raw's accidental discovery on the morning of the 22nd forced the commanders to attack immediately. What impressed Zulu veterans in their recollections wasn't the victory itself, but the discipline their forces maintained. Warriors of the chest had lain in the grass under sustained rifle fire for nearly 20 minutes, taking casualties without breaking formation, waiting for the flanking horns to complete their work. This level of fire discipline under modern weapons demonstrated training that rivaled European armies. One Zulu warrior of the Umakijo regiment named Meloka Zulu Kasihayo, whose father's actions had been used as one of the pretexts for the British invasion, later described the advance under fire. The bullets were like hail. Men fell around us constantly. But we'd been told that the British fire would slacken, that if we could endure long enough, their guns would fail them. And it happened as our commanders said. The fire that had been continuous became scattered. That was when we knew we would win. This account reveals that Zulu commanders understood the limitations of the Martini Henry rifle, particularly its tendency to overheat and jam during sustained fire. They had developed tactics specifically to exploit this weakness, absorbing casualties during the initial heavy fire while waiting for the inevitable degradation in British firepower. The Right Horn's movement around Isandlwana mountain was perhaps the most impressive feat of the battle. The Ukandempemvu regiment, approximately 5,000 warriors, had covered more than 4 miles at a running pace over broken ground, maintained formation while out of sight of their commanders, and attacked the British rear at exactly the right moment to prevent any organised retreat. This required not just physical endurance, but tactical timing, an initiative from junior commanders who understood the overall battle plan and executed their part without direct orders. European military theorists of the period believed that only highly trained professional armies could execute such coordinated manoeuvres. The Zulu achievement at Isandlwana challenged this assumption fundamentally. The speed of the Zulu advance also revealed something the British had failed to understand about African military systems. European infantry of the period trained to march in step at a regulated pace of approximately 3 miles per hour. Zulu warriors moved at a loping run that could be sustained for hours, covering ground at more than double the speed of European troops. This mobility meant that Zulu forces could concentrate faster, maneuver more quickly, and operate across greater distances than British commanders anticipated. At Isandlwana, this speed differential proved decisive. British troops attempting to retreat found themselves overtaken by warriors who could run them down over distances of miles. The tactical doctrine that failed the British at Isandlwana wasn't unique to southern Africa. It was the standard approach used throughout the empire against indigenous forces. The assumption was that modern rifles firing in disciplined volleys could break any attack through sheer firepower. This had worked against the Maori in New Zealand, against various Indian forces, against Afghan tribesmen, and against African armies from Ethiopia to West Africa. But all of these previous victories had involved either prepared, defensive positions or enemies who lacked the tactical sophistication to effectively close with British formations. The Zulus were different. They had developed over decades a military system specifically designed to defeat firepower through speed and manoeuvre, and they had the discipline to execute that system even under the most horrific casualties. The ammunition problem at Isandlwana became the subject of intense investigation and controversy. Some accounts blamed Quartermaster Edward Bloomfield of the 2nd Battalion 24th Regiment for refusing to issue ammunition from his wagons to soldiers from the 1st Battalion, insisting on proper paperwork even as the battle raged. Other accounts suggested that the problem was purely mechanical, that the screwed-down lids on ammunition boxes simply couldn't be opened fast enough under combat conditions. The truth was probably a combination of factors. The British ammunition supply system was designed for set-piece battles, where prepared positions would be established and ammunition distributed before fighting began. It wasn't designed for a mobile engagement where consumption rates would spike suddenly and unpredictably. Additionally, the Martini-Henry rifle's high rate of fire meant that soldiers could exhaust their carried ammunition in minutes of intense combat. A soldier with 70 rounds in his pouches, firing at 12 rounds per minute, would be empty in less than 6 minutes. Resupplying hundreds of men simultaneously under these conditions would have challenged any logistic system. The battle also revealed the limitations of British colonial troops and native auxiliaries. The Natal native contingent, African troops recruited by the British and armed with obsolete firearms and traditional weapons, broke and ran when the Zulu left Horn outflanked them. This wasn't cowardice. Many of these men were traditional enemies of the Zulus and understood Zulu fighting capabilities far better than their British officers. They could see the tactical situation developing, could see that they were about to be surrounded, and made the rational decision to flee rather than die in a hopeless position. British military culture, which valued standing and dying over retreating and surviving, interpreted this as shameful behaviour. But from an African military perspective, these troops were simply refusing to commit suicide at the orders of foreign commanders who didn't understand the enemy they faced. The colonial volunteers, mostly British settlers in South Africa, performed better but still suffered heavy casualties. These men, unlike the British regulars, had experience with African warfare and some understanding of Zulu tactics. Many of the survivors who reached Rorke's Drift were colonial cavalry who had the horses and local knowledge to find escape routes. Their accounts provided much of the detailed information about how the battle developed, because they had been mobile enough to observe the Zulu formations and movements that the infantry, locked in their positions, never saw. One colonial volunteer named James Brickhill provided a detailed account that revealed the psychological impact of facing the Zulu advance. He described watching the Zulu chest emerge from behind the ridge as a dark line that seemed to extend indefinitely in both directions. As the warriors began their advance, he noted that they moved with a rhythmic, almost mechanical precision, maintaining alignment and responding to commands he couldn't hear. Most disturbing to Brickhill was the silence. Unlike European armies that advanced with drums and bugles, or other African forces that attacked with war cries, the Zulus came on in near silence until the final charge. This unnatural quiet, combined with the visual impact of thousands of warriors moving in coordination, created a psychological effect that he described as more unnerving than the actual combat. The role of Zulu commanders during the battle demonstrated a level of battlefield control that challenged European assumptions about primitive warfare. Chiefs Nshingwayo and Mavumengwana, both elderly men who observed the battle from a nearby hill, directed the engagement through a system of runners and visible signals. Different regiments could be seen responding to orders, changing direction or speed, holding position, or attacking, all while under fire and spread across miles of terrain. This command and control capability required a sophisticated system of military training, where junior commanders understood the overall battle plan and could execute their parts independently while remaining responsive to higher direction. European observers, when they later learned of this system, compared it favourably to their own military organisations, though this comparison was rarely made public in Britain, where it might undermine narratives about African military inferiority. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana had immediate strategic consequences beyond the destruction of one British column. That same afternoon, approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors, mainly from the reserve regiments that hadn't been heavily engaged, continued westward to attack the supply depot at Rorke's Drift. This position was defended by approximately 150 British troops, mostly from B Company of the 2nd Battalion 24th Regiment, along with sick and wounded men from the camp hospital. The defenders, warned by survivors from Isandlwana, had time to fortify the mission station, using mealie bags and biscuit boxes to create defensive walls. The resulting battle, which lasted through the night of January 22nd into the morning of January 23rd, became one of the most celebrated defensive actions in British military history. The defence of Rorke's Drift involved sustained close-quarters combat as Zulu warriors repeatedly stormed the makeshift fortifications, only to be driven back by rifle fire at point-blank range. Unlike at Isandlwana, the defenders had consolidated their ammunition, established proper firing positions and created overlapping fields of fire. The Zulu warriors, having already fought one major battle that day, and having marched more than 20 miles, were exhausted. Moreover, the attacking force lacked the coordination and command structure of the main army. These were reserve troops, less experienced, attacking a prepared position without proper reconnaissance or tactical planning. After suffering approximately 400 casualties for no gain, the Zulu force withdrew at dawn. The British propaganda machine seized on Rorke's Drift as evidence that British soldiers, properly positioned and supplied, were invincible. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to defenders, the most ever given for a single action. The battle became the subject of poems, paintings, and eventually films. What was conveniently ignored in this celebration was that Rorke's Drift proved the lessons of Isandlwana. British troops needed prepared positions, adequate ammunition supply, and concentrated firepower to defeat Zulu attacks. In open ground, without these advantages, even the best British regiments could be destroyed. Lord Chelmsford's reaction to the disaster revealed the limits of British military thinking. Upon returning to Isandlwana on January 23rd and viewing the destruction, Chelmsford's primary concern was deflecting blame from himself. His official report emphasised the failure to fortify the camp and implied that Polaine had mishandled the defence. What Chelmsford couldn't acknowledge was that his fundamental strategy had been flawed. By dividing his force and leaving the camp vulnerable, by underestimating Zulu capabilities, by assuming that British firepower alone would guarantee victory, he had created the conditions for disaster. Chelmsford retained his command, partly through political connections and partly because replacing him would have required admitting the magnitude of the failure, but his reputation never recovered. The British military response to Isandlwana involved a massive reinforcement of forces in South Africa. 6 additional infantry battalions were dispatched from Britain and India, bringing the total British forces to more than 20,000 men. More cavalry, more artillery, including the latest Gatling guns and rocket batteries, more supplies and more modern equipment poured into South Africa. The British government, humiliated by the defeat, was determined to crush the Zulu kingdom with overwhelming force. This escalation revealed a truth about colonial warfare that Isandlwana had exposed. Indigenous forces might win battles, but they couldn't win wars against industrial powers that could replace losses indefinitely. The subsequent British campaign in Zululand was conducted with extreme caution. Chelmsford, desperate to avoid another disaster, moved his reinforced army in tight formation with extensive fortifications at every camp. Progress was slow but methodical. Zulu forces, unable to draw the British into another ambush or catch them in the open, could only harass the advance. Several smaller engagements occurred, including battles at Hlobane and Kambula, where British forces in prepared positions repulsed Zulu attacks with heavy casualties. The Zulus won none of these subsequent engagements decisively, not because their tactical system had failed, but because the British no longer fought on terms that allowed Zulu tactics to succeed. The final confrontation came at Ulundi on July 4, 1879. Chelmsford had learned from Isandlwana. He formed his entire force, approximately 5,000 European troops and 1,000 native auxiliaries, into a hollow square with artillery and Gatling guns at the corners. When the Zulu army, approximately 20,000 warriors, attacked this formation in their traditional horns of the buffalo pattern, they were slaughtered. The square formation eliminated the Zulu advantage of encirclement. Warriors attacking from any direction faced massed rifle fire from multiple sides. The artillery and Gatling guns, firing into dense masses of warriors, caused horrific casualties. The Zulu charges, which at Isandlwana had overwhelmed British lines, couldn't penetrate the square's concentrated firepower. After losing more than 1,500 dead for minimal British casualties, the Zulu army withdrew in defeat. Chelmsford ordered Ulundi burned and declared the war won. King Cetshwayo was captured in August 1879 and exiled to Cape Town. The Zulu kingdom was divided into 13 separate chiefdoms, deliberately organised to prevent any unified military resistance. The Impi system, the age-based regimental structure that had made the Zulu army so effective, was formally abolished by British decree. Warriors were ordered to return to their homesteads. The military kraals where regiments had trained and lived were dismantled. In less than a year, one of Africa's most sophisticated military systems had been effectively destroyed, not through battlefield defeat of its tactical doctrine, but through the systematic dismantling of its social and political structures. The treatment of Isandlwana in British military history is revealing. For years, the battle was portrayed as an aberration, a tragic accident caused by failures of supply and preparation rather than a legitimate tactical defeat. The heroism of the 24th Regiment was emphasised, with soldiers praised for dying bravely rather than being analysed for why they died at all. The tactical sophistication of the Zulu military system was acknowledged grudgingly, if at all. British military doctrine didn't change significantly after Isandlwana. The lessons that should have been learned about the importance of respecting indigenous military capabilities, about the limitations of firepower against mobile and disciplined opponents, about the need to adapt tactics to specific enemies rather than applying universal doctrines, these lessons were largely ignored. Zulu oral histories of Isandlwana, preserved through generations, tell a different story. In Zulu tradition, the battle is remembered as the greatest victory of the kingdom, the day when Zulu warriors proved their courage and their military system's effectiveness against the most powerful empire in the world. Warriors who fought at Isandlwana were honoured for the rest of their lives. The battle is commemorated in songs and stories that emphasise not just the victory, but the discipline and sacrifice required to achieve it. Zulu accounts emphasise that victory came at tremendous cost, that the warriors who died buying time for the horns to complete their encirclement were heroes who made the victory possible through their willingness to endure British fire without breaking. The physical battlefield at Isandlwana remains largely unchanged. The mountain still dominates the landscape, its distinctive shape immediately recognisable. Scattered across the ground are cairns and memorials marking where companies and individual soldiers fell. The Zulu dead were buried in mass graves that have never been precisely located. Archaeological work on the battlefield in recent decades has recovered thousands of artefacts, spent cartridges, uniform buttons, weapon fragments, and personal items that provide physical evidence of the battle's progression. The distribution of British cartridge cases shows where firing lines stood and how they collapsed. Concentrations of artefacts mark the locations of last stands, where small groups fought until overwhelmed. Modern military analysis of Isandlwana recognises it as one of the most significant colonial battles of the 19th century precisely because it demonstrated that technological superiority didn't guarantee victory. The battle is studied at military academies as an example of how tactical doctrine and leadership can overcome material disadvantages, how mobility and speed can defeat firepower, and how underestimating an enemy's capabilities can lead to disaster. The Zulu military system, far from being primitive, is now recognised as a sophisticated tactical doctrine specifically adapted to the conditions and opponents it faced. The human cost of Isandlwana extended far beyond the battlefield. Wives in Britain received telegrams informing them that their husbands had been killed in a place they'd never heard of by an enemy they'd been assured was no threat. The 24th Regiment's depot at Brecon in Wales became a place of mourning as casualty lists arrived. Entire companies had been wiped out, leaving communities devastated by loss. In Zululand, thousands of women mourned warriors who had died fulfilling their military obligations to their king. The victory that had seemed so glorious in the immediate aftermath became hollow as British retribution destroyed the kingdom and scattered the survivors. The strategic futility of the Zulu victory at Isandlwana highlights the impossible situation faced by indigenous peoples confronting European imperialism. The Zulus had developed one of the most effective military systems in Africa. Their warriors were brave, disciplined and skillfully led. At Isandlwana, they achieved a tactical masterpiece, destroying a modern military force through superior manoeuvre and fighting skill. Yet none of this mattered strategically. The British could replace their losses. The Zulus couldn't. British industrial capacity meant that defeat in one battle was merely an inconvenience. Zulu victories, no matter how complete, couldn't translate into survival because the underlying power imbalance was too great. The legacy of Isandlwana in military history is complex. For the British, it remains an embarrassing defeat, often overshadowed in popular memory by the more comfortable narrative of Rorke's Drift, where heroic defenders triumphed against overwhelming odds. For Zulus, it represents the pinnacle of their military achievement, proof that their ancestors were formidable warriors who defeated the most powerful army in the world through skill and courage. For military historians, it stands as a case study in how tactical excellence can overcome technological advantages, and how institutional arrogance and cultural assumptions can blind even professional militaries to genuine threats. The battles that followed Isandlwana in subsequent colonial conflicts showed that European armies learned some lessons, if not always the right ones. British forces became more cautious, built more fortifications, and took indigenous military capabilities more seriously. But the fundamental assumption that industrial militaries would inevitably triumph over pre-industrial ones remained unchanged, and generally that assumption proved correct, not because of superior tactics or braver soldiers, but because industrial economies could sustain military efforts that traditional societies couldn't match. On January 22, 1879, for a few hours beneath a sphinx-shaped mountain, the Zulu military system proved that it was among the finest military organizations in the world. The Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo, executed with precision against a modern enemy and achieved complete victory. 20,000 warriors, armed primarily with spears and shields, destroyed 1,800 soldiers armed with breech-loading rifles and artillery. The tactical competence required to accomplish this, the discipline to maintain formation under sustained rifle fire, the physical endurance to execute complex maneuvers at a running pace over miles of terrain, the courage to close with an enemy whose weapons could kill at hundreds of yards, all of this demonstrated military excellence that any army in the world would have been proud to achieve. That this excellence couldn't save the Zulu kingdom from conquest doesn't diminish the achievement. It only highlights the brutal reality that in the imperial age, tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. The Zulus won the battle, but were always going to lose the war. Yet for one day, they proved that spears and shields in the hands of disciplined warriors following sophisticated tactics could collapse the ranks of the British Empire, and that achievement echoes through history.